I'm very grateful for the invitation to deliver the Sandars lectures. Cambridge and Robinson College in particular occupy an important place in my life because it is here that 32 years ago, my life in the UK started as an Erasmus student in 1990. My history tutor in college was Martin Brett, and I studied medieval history and Latin literature with Christopher Brooke and Peter Dronke. My fellow Erasmus student in college, here in the photo, was Taco Dibitz, now director of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Here I also met my future husband. Fast forward 5 years, and I was working on the Incunabula collection of the Bodleian Library. When I opened this Bible and read the inscription, this book belongs to the monks of the Congregation of Santa Giustina of Padua, and it is allocated to San Giorgio Maggiore of Venice, shelf marked 773. 3 questions immediately follow. 773, where are the other books in this library? How did this book end up in Oxford, and why? We are talking about the library of the Benedictines of San Giorgio Maggiore on the island facing St. Mark's Square in Venice. These are the questions which every scholar, every cataloger of historical books, and indeed collections, ask themselves all the time. Laura Nuvoloni certainly asked these questions when she catalogued this copy of Boetius, now in Cambridge University Library, also from San Giorgio Maggiore. As did Paul Needham, who in fact expanded the question into a project by starting his Index Possessorum Incunabulorum, where he kept track of a number of incunabula from San Giorgio Maggiore, today in other libraries. The index, or IPI, provides similar context for thousands of other collections. In fact, over 34,000 collections, and it is today publicly available on the website of the Consortium of European Research Libraries, CERL. The index has continued to grow since it was made public, and I think it is well known to many of you attending this lecture today and valued as an important source. These were also the questions which, after 10 years of intensive examination of incunabula in the Bodleian Library, inspired me to create, back in 2009, Material Evidence in Incunabula, the digital resource where today we track the history of tens of thousands of 15th century printed books. MEI is another resource which I believe will be familiar to many of you. But let me give you the latest numbers so that we are all on the same page. MEI includes data on the 500-year history of over 60,000 copies from 597 libraries in 26 countries, 4 continents. The database was designed to address 2 overarching unanswered historical issues. First, the distribution of early printed books. Second, the dispersal and subsequent digital reconstruction of the libraries which held them. The Incunabula collection of San Giorgio Maggiore has been reconstructed by Dorit Reins of the University of Venice Ca' Foscari, and here with us today, Lavinia Prosdocini, formerly curator of manuscript and rare books at the University Library of Padua, and myself, in a volume whose publication we are marking today, How the Secularization of Religious Houses Transformed the Libraries of Europe, edited by Dorit Reins, myself, and our dear friend and colleague, Richard Sharp, who sadly passed away in 2020. In this volume, San Giorgio Maggiore is treated as a study case of the reconstruction of a library collection using MEI, that is the physical evidence from surviving books, and supplementing it with documentary evidence, specifically that relating to the suppression and dispersal of this collection in the modern period. MEI lists today 180 incunabula from San Giorgio. Not only those whose location was historically determinable, such as Padua, where Venetian books were gathered following the Napoleonic suppression of religious monasteries, or Paris, where particularly valuable editions were taken by the French, and Venice, where a few of these were sent back after restitution of cultural artifacts was agreed by the Congress of Vienna. But copies have been traced in many other and unexpected places: Brescia, Milan, Mantua, Treviso, Cesena, Lucca, Rome in Italy, Locarno in Switzerland, Chantilly and Paris in France, Edinburgh, Manchester, Oxford, London and Cambridge in the UK, Copenhagen, Berlin, Uppsala, Vienna, Harvard, and Jerusalem. The support of documentary evidence, moreover, has allowed us to include in the reconstruction of the library's 15th century books some 78 editions which are presently unlocated, but probably survive somewhere out there. These were identified from the lists of books removed from Venice to Paris by the French, the lists of the books taken to Padua according to the logistical plans drawn up to implement the secularizations of monasteries and their assets, and the lists of books which were returned from Paris to Venice. Archival documents are of enormous value in balancing the physical evidence which the surviving books of the surviving copies of books provide. It may not come as a surprise that among these still unlocated copies are works of classical Roman history, Avicenna, Euclid, Pliny's natural history, medicine, Greek grammar, logic, classical philosophy, Boccaccio, and even a copy of the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, not the kind of work we expect to find in a monastic setting. Without this evidence, our understanding of the intellectual interests of the community of San Giorgio would be diminished and distorted. I will come back to the need to integrate material, documentary, and bibliographical evidence. But let me move now from this example to a general consideration. Books are, by their intrinsic nature, mobile objects. But in the long life of the 15th century editions, we have to distinguish between two kinds of mobility. The first, a mobility which pertains to the distribution of books, the books as a vehicle of text, and the fact that a print run of an edition needs to be distributed widely to be absorbed into the market. While the second pertains to their survival in the face of dispersal and loss, determined more by the book's status as an object. I have to say that Italian books scored highly in both cases. MEI addresses effectively both types of mobility. Most importantly, it allows us to study and understand these complex phenomena, how the distribution and the survival of books influenced the spread of literacy and of knowledge, and more generally, social, economic, and intellectual history, and also to observe the huge role that politics played in the dissemination of cultural heritage. The examples which follow display a varying experience of book mobility. Let me start with the early book distribution network in Europe. Very few documents survive, but we still have 500,000 books which contain the evidence of their mobility. We just needed a way to convert that physical evidence into historical evidence, which Incunabula, today in Cambridge University Library, bear witness to such early distribution. For example, what books printed in Italy and distributed and used in Germany can be found today in Cambridge University Library? To answer this question, I set the following query in MEI. Cambridge institution combined with Italian production and German provenance. The results include the orations of the humanist Francesco Filelfo, printed in Milan in 1484 and owned by Gabriel von Heydt, elected Bishop of Eichstätt in 1496. He was portrayed with Saint Willibald and Saint Walpurga by Lucas Cranach the Elder in 1520, in this picture today in the Staatsgalerie of Bamberg. His arms, 3 shells, and motto are depicted in the coat of arms of the book. In 1475, Gabriel inherited the library of his uncle, the eminent humanist Albrecht von Heydt, while between 1478 and 1485, he studied in Bologna, Pavia, and Padua. It was probably in Pavia, as a student, that he purchased the book and had it decorated and bound. The book remained in the library of the Prince Bishop of Eichstätt, known as Bibliotheca Aulica, as in the description, which had been founded around 1450. During the secularizations of Joseph II, it was the gathering point for the collections of the dissolved houses and eventually became the core of the University Library of Eichstätt, though a small part ended up in the City and State Library of Augsburg, while some treasures from it are also found in Munich. In fact, a number of its books became more widely dispersed. In MEI, 5 are in Cambridge, 5 in Bodley, 2 in the British Library, 1 in Harvard, 1 in Milan National Library are described. IPI lists further Ghent, Gdansk, Uppsala, Manchester, Princeton, Toronto. Who knows where else copies from the Eichstätt Library remain to be found. Another Italian book in Cambridge University Library, purchased by a German student while studying in Italy, is the edition of Dante's Commedia, printed in Mantua in 1472. Bibliographical evidence shows that it had belonged to the famous humanist Willibald Pirkheimer, who was born in Eichstätt, was a friend of Gabriel von Eyb, and had studied in Padua. His collection, as is well known, was sold by his heirs, the Imhoffs, in 1636 to Thomas Howard, 14th Earl of Arundel, and was subsequently donated to the Royal Society of London by Henry Howard, 6th Duke of Norfolk, in 1667. No proof of this evidence can be found in the book, though it might have been lost when the book was rebound by Henry Hood in the 19th century. The book was donated to Cambridge University Library by Arthur William Young, alumnus of Trinity College, in 1933. Petrus de Monte on Civil and Canon Law, printed in Padua in 1480, was purchased in Königsberg, today Kaliningrad, in 1589 by the lawyer Johann Baptista Schumann, and later used by Andreas Fabricius, Chancellor of Kaliningrad until 1602, before eventually entering the library of the Cistercians of Langein in Bavaria in 1728, from which, presumably after the secularizations of Joseph II, the book came on the antiquarian book trade and was purchased by the collector George Dunn in 1906 and by Cambridge University Library in 1914. So Padua, Kaliningrad, Langein, the UK. In this example, as in many other cases, the context, specifically the presence in a monastic institution throughout the 18th century, and the later appearance on the international antiquarian book market, allows us to infer that the book must have gone through the secularizations. I will come back to this issue of book survival, but let me give you a couple of more examples of evidence of early distribution from the Cambridge University Library collection. Jenson's Venice edition of Canon Law, Gregory IX's Decretals, was decorated in southern Germany and acquired by a not yet identified owner, possibly from the Insperg family of Frankfurt, which had a strong legal tradition and a very similar coat of arms. A legal incunable, today in Harvard Law School, was owned by Karl von Insperg in 1500. The Tragedies of Seneca, printed in Venice in 1493, once bound together with the Pharsalia of Lucien, also printed in Venice in 1493, were sold by a Lübeck bookseller in 1497, so 4 years after publication. Presumably, as Needham noticed in IPI, the bookseller was the printer Johannes Schneller, highlighting interesting commercial contacts between Venetian and Northern German printers. The purchaser was the theologian and future rector of the University of Rostock, Barthold Moller, identified by the cataloger through a similar inscription in another CUL volume. Very impressive. The Bessarion, printed by Swenham and Panarts in Rome in 1469, was in the library of the canons of San Salvatore of Bologna very early on, to judge by the humanist hand of the inscription, and was still there in 1533, when an inventory of the library was prepared, a document today in the Vatican Library. The library of San Salvatore was the most important library in the city of Bologna after that of San Domenico. But in the 19th century, the book was sold as a duplicate from Munich Staatsbibliothek, suggesting it came from a suppressed German monastery. Sorry, they're still here. The book is not listed among those taken away by the French at the end of the 18th century, which suggests that he may have moved from monastery to monastery via a religious before the 19th century. Laura Miani and Maria Cristina Batti of Bologna University Library identified over 32 incunabula still at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France today from this important library of San Salvatore. A shared provenance, the final volume of the Incunabula catalogue of the BNF, which will be published later this year, will bring to light more easily. Other books from San Salvatore are today here in Cambridge, in Harvard, in Sassari, in Venice, as well as in the University Library of Bologna, which received the restitutions from the French. As a final example in this group, there is Alexander de Ariostis on usury. The author was an observant Franciscan canon lawyer and theologian based in Bologna, who died around 1486. The date of this edition is only work which was printed in the 15th century in Bologna. This today rather obscure figure had spent quite a bit of time in the Holy Land on behalf of the Pope, Sixtus IV, to assist the Christian Maronites in Lebanon. The decoration is contemporary, and as paced down, there is a 14th century legal Bolognese manuscript as a reuse. The contemporary binding itself is rather fabulous. There are flower-shaped nails holding some material and recycled manuscript. And on the rear board, there are some trefoil-shaped catches. The book was purchased in Florence in 1588 by the Franciscan preacher Fausto de Fausti, whose inscription can be seen in the lower margin. He was later the guardian of the convent of Santa Croce in Florence, where the book must have remained until the second round of secularizations, which took place in Italy in the 1860s, following the creation of the unified Italian state. By 1910, the book was in Munich, sold by Ludwig Rosenthal. Eventually, it was purchased by Cambridge University Library in 1497. In the same year, 1588, in Florence, De Fausti also purchased a copy of Pseudo Nicolaus of Lyra Preceptorium Divine Legis, printed in Zwolle in 1500. Only 12 copies survive today of this edition, of which only one is found in Italy, in the National Library of Rome. This is very rare and valuable evidence of the importation of Dutch books into Italy. These two books, owned by the same person and the later institution, had very different afterlife. While the Preceptorium, probably because not very good looking, moved to another Franciscan library in Rome, which was itself secularized in 1875, the better looking De Ariostis entered the antiquarian market eventually arriving to the UK via Germany. I would like to stress that next to nothing has been written on the early import of non-Italian books into Italy, a phenomenon exemplified by the Suole edition. When did it start? Which were the points of entry? Was it widespread? Can we quantify it? I pay particular attention to the cases I encounter. Among the Incunabula of San Giorgio Maggiore, the book which shows the earliest evidence of acquisition is the Razionale of Guglielmo Durando, the famous Mainz edition of Fust and Schoeffer, a copy subsequently taken to Paris and still there today. The former San Giorgio Maggiore and now Paris copy was purchased just 2 years after publication in 1461, most likely in Venice, in the light of the currency which is quoted in the inscription, 18 ducats. Another case of early import of foreign editions into Italy is the work of Johannes Cassianus on Cenobitic institutions, printed in Basel in 1485, and also in the library of San Giorgio Maggiore, with an inscription in a humanist hand and shelf mark number 886. The copy is today in Mantua. This book from San Giorgio was later on in the library of another great monastery of the Benedictine congregation, Polirone, wrote there by a religious, or by exchange. And you can see the 18th century inscription and stamp. Indeed, the Library of Mantua preserves also another edition of Cassianus, printed in Basel in 1497, which belonged to Polirone. This evidence is highlighting a possible network between the printer Amerbach in Basel and Italian Benedictine congregations. I happen to know that the Venetian bookseller Francesco De Madis, about whom you will hear more in the third lecture, sold 7 copies of the 1485 edition in 1487, just 2 years after publication. It is therefore quite likely that this volume of Cassianus, printed in Basel in 1485, was sold to the Benedictines of San Giorgio Maggiore by the bookseller Francesco De Madis in Venice in 1487. Once an edition of this same work gets published in Venice in 1491, San Giorgio acquires also a copy of that edition. But this is a staple work for a monastic institution, so the presence of 2 editions of the same work, both in San Giorgio and at Polirone, should not surprise us. Please also note the shelf mark numbers. 315 for the Durandos purchased in 1461, 886 for Cassianus, acquired probably in 1487, indicating the huge rate of growth in the library's collection. As the reconstruction of the San Giorgio collection I mentioned at the beginning reveals, it was in fact filled with hundreds of early printed editions. The last 2 examples discussed before, this San Giorgio parenthesis, of books now in Cambridge University Library from San Salvatore of Bologna and Santa Croce of Florence are, yes, evidence of how books moved from Italy to Germany, in answer to my query set in MEI, but actually relate to the second type or phase of mobility, connected to the later life of these books, the ways in which they survive once their initial commercial viability had faded. Both books left Italy rather late, not as part of the European commercial distribution network, but in the subsequent process which eventually led them to Cambridge University Library. Today, only 4 incunables from Santa Croce have been identified in the National Library of Florence, which should have received the books from the libraries of the suppressed monasteries in the city. Where are the others? My impression, which needs to be tested against more evidence, is that books from Florentine monasteries entered the antiquarian market on a huge scale. This was a market dominated by Florentine figures of the caliber of Leo Samuel Olszki and Tamaro de Marinis, or Giuseppe Martini from nearby Lucca. And these books can be found in several American libraries, although it is frequently the case that their provenance from Italian suppressed monasteries has not yet been recognized. But let me move on now to discuss further the second kind of mobility tied with the patterns of survival of books, something we have inevitably already encountered in the examples I have just shown you. In recent years, a welcome number of studies and projects have been focusing on the great rise in the market of antiquarian books and manuscripts in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. Christian Jensen discussed in his 2008 Lion Lectures, Revolution and the Antiquarian Book, the emergence of old books as commodities and their use in reshaping the past during the French Revolutionary period, including the activities of dealers such as Jean-Baptiste Maugérat, who had been given official responsibilities in 1802 for the spoliation of German libraries annexed by the French. More recently, David McKittrick examined in his The Invention of Rare Books how the concept of rare books was developed from the 16th century onwards by collectors, the book trade, and libraries. And his Readers in a Revolution, how exhibitions, libraries, booksellers, scholars, and popular writers of the 19th century contributed to the world of book studies as we know it today. A final example of this trend, the ongoing Cultivate Manuscripts project, funded by the European Research Council and led by Laura Cleaver at the University of London, explores how the trade in medieval manuscripts between 1900 and 1945 from Europe to the United States affected the development of ideas about the nature and value of European culture during this period. The attention is again on the roles of collectors, scholars, and dealers in the formation of collections of medieval manuscripts and the impact of this on scholarship. But an important question remains. What was behind the increased availability of antiquarian books on the market? what enabled the activities of scholars, booksellers, private collectors, and libraries? The answer that I would like to propose is the political enactment of the secularizations of religious institutions and the sequestration and dispersal on the part of the state of their movable and immovable assets, including their libraries. From the 16th century onwards, a vast number of early printed books have been displaced and in part destroyed. There is a very large body of evidence to support the existence of connections between major European political events and the sequestration, disposal, transfer, and sale of book heritage. Secularizations of the religious houses of Europe, taking possession of their property, were implemented under Henry VIII, Joseph II, Napoleon, the Spanish liberal governments, which enacted the so-called desamortization. In the picture, you have Juan Álvarez Mendizábal, Prime Minister of Spain, in 1835-1836, and the formation of the Italian state in 1861. In the picture, King Vittorio Emanuele II and Camillo Benso, Count of Cavour. We can hardly find a library in Europe today which has been unaffected by these historical events. The connection between political change and the migration of book heritage was first systematically investigated in its diachronic and Europe-wide dimension in a 2012 conference, which I organized together with Rit and Richard in Oxford, the proceedings of which are in the volume just published by Brepols. In his brilliantly incisive paper on dissolution and dispersion in 16th century England, Understanding the Remains, Richard perceptibly observed that the almost complete destruction of British monastic book collections is a strong reminder of what happened when technological change, printing with movable type, and political change overlap. Never again in European history did these destabilizing factors collide so explosively. In 16th century England, most of the manuscripts and printed books from closed down monasteries were simply destroyed. Antiquarianism and the correspondent impulse to collect, both of which forged the very idea of heritage, had not fully developed yet. But the aftermath of the Reformation on the continent, the 30 Years' War, the French Revolution, the national dissolutions of religious houses by liberal government, the October Revolution, and the two world wars have certainly led to more partial destructions and dispersals of book collections. And the dispersals have been on a vast scale. We can hardly find a library in Europe today which has been unaffected by these historical events, whether negatively, because its collections were dispersed, or positively, because it was formed out of or its existing collections were enhanced by what was dispersed. Books which were judged to be important, useful, or valuable were destined for the main new public libraries. Less valuable material or duplicates were directed to schools, seminaries, and the like, while books regarded as serving no purpose, cheap printing, liturgy, the content of most libraries of female religious, were sold and destroyed. It is interesting to see how the criteria of retention in the early modern and the modern period actually matched. Of course, at every step of these processes, books could be abstracted by various means and in different circumstances to find themselves in the developing local, national, or international antiquarian book market. But this generic summary does not begin to describe the realities, political, economic, social, and cultural, entangled in these movements, of which the trade was but one part. For the 2012 Oxford Conference, I singled out all the incunabula from religious institutions which eventually entered the Bodleian Library and the Houghton Library at Harvard, using the index of provenance of the printed catalogues of the two institutions, Bod Inc. and Walsh. During the summer, and in preparation of these lectures, with the help of two students from my course at La Sapienza University in Rome, Gabriele Racciti and Teresa Hartwig, we extracted similar data from the index of provenances of the catalogues of incunabula of Cambridge University Library, Oates, Munich, Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, and the British Library. The results were given to be mapped as a special project to Henri-Jean, an undergraduate computer scientist from King's College London. During the last 2 years, I've been collaborating with the computer science department of King's College London in the development of a book tracker to visualize the movement of books using MEI records. The result of Dengi's maps is, in my opinion, very impressive and powerfully conveys the extent of the secularization phenomenon. The maps can be viewed from the perspective of the monasteries and their libraries, or from that of the books. Basically, we have been counting the monasteries as well as the books coming from each of them. In the map, the orange column is Harvard, the pink column is Munich, and I will now enlarge the UK. Where the purple column is Oxford, the yellow column is the British Library, and the green column is Cambridge. The numbers are staggering. 1,328 books from 567 monasteries are today in the Bodleian Library. 1,913 books from 769 different monasteries are in the British Library. 654 books from 355 monasteries are in Cambridge University Library. Outside the UK, 655 books from 372 monasteries are in Harvard. Finally, 9,236 books from 306 monasteries are at the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek of Munich. Some 13,786 books in total from hundreds of monasteries. And this is the content of just 5 libraries, with impressive holdings, for sure, but still the tip of the iceberg. In MEI, a search for books whose method of acquisition is institutional transfer, this is how we capture evidence of secularized monasteries, returns over 4,700 editions in over 7,800 copies. And these are only the copies which have been properly tagged. This amount does not include the ones from the Bodleian, nor most of those from Cambridge University Library, because their uploading into MEI has not been followed by manual editing, although in Cambridge this has started. The result includes books from Zurich and Solothurn in Switzerland, Rome, Venice, Padua, Milan, Brescia, Florence, Cagliari in Italy, Vilnius in Lithuania, Wrocław in Poland, Madrid and Barcelona in Spain, some from London British Library and Edinburgh, The Hague, Yale, Martin in Slovenia, and many others. But let's go back to the maps. As you can see, surrounding the large map, we have, so to speak, a breakdown of the monasteries of provenance for each library. Monasteries whose books are today in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in Oxford, in Munich, in London. If we click on the modern library column, for example, Cambridge, we will get a breakdown of the type of monasteries whose books are in Cambridge University Library today. 66 from Benedictine monasteries, 61 Franciscan monasteries, and so on. If we look at the books from suppressed monasteries today in Cambridge, 108 belong to Benedictine monasteries, 98 to Franciscans, and so on. Let's look at Munich, which received many multiple copies from a smaller number of monasteries, mostly German. 3,271 books from Benedictine houses, 2,169 from Augustinians, etc. In Oxford, too, the largest number of books comes from Benedictine monasteries, 247 of them. If we click on a country, for example, France, we get the number of books with that provenance, which ended up in each of the 5 libraries. 366 books, 106 of them are today in the British Library, 8 in Oxford, 50 in Munich, 39 in Cambridge, 37 in Harvard. The same if we click on Italy, 668 books, primarily in the British Library and Oxford. Here it is interesting to notice the small number of books from Italian monastic houses today in Munich. This is a reminder that the vast majority of Italian printed books went to Germany via their early distribution in the 15th and 16th centuries. If we look at Germany, we immediately see how the majority of the 11,669 books are today in the Munich library. At the same time, it shows how some 2,572 books, which were probably there immediately after the secularizations, are today outside Germany, the result of the duplicate sales in the 19th century, as analyzed well by Bettina Wagner in our volume. This also means that we have to find ways to look at these books in Germany and abroad together if we want to understand fully the consistency of these German monastic collections. Spain is well represented in bodies. Books from Belgium are equally spread among British Library, Oxford, and Cambridge. Books from Austria among the British Library, Oxford, and Harvard. Books from the Netherlands are mostly in Cambridge, and books from the UK monasteries, unsurprisingly, are in the 3 UK libraries today: Netherlands and the UK. By expanding the map, we get greater granularity. Here are the monasteries whose books ended up in Cambridge, that is, from the holding library's perspective. Here instead are all the monasteries in Italy whose books can today be found in the 5 holding libraries, that is, from the country's perspective. It would take more than 1 hour to comment the data emerging from these maps. You will be able to access them soon online. But let me offer some general considerations. First, the quantity. Second, how widespread the dispersal is geographically. Third, the precision of data we can work with thanks to the very high quality cataloging in these 5 libraries. Fourth, let's not assume for a minute that the dispersal is random. Trends in the dispersals can and should be detected and studied. Much connected with the research on secularized libraries is the identification of the agents of dispersal. Even in countries not affected by the secularizations, such as Austria, where the policy was never implemented owing to the death of Joseph II, other factors contributed to the dispersal. There are plenty of books and manuscripts from Austrian religious institutions around the world. Some 330 Incunabula from 142 different monasteries can be found today in just the 5 libraries examined in our map. How did they leave Austria and why? The answer is the willingness to dispose of material which was perceived to be no longer relevant to a religious institution, with the mediation of individuals who had the confidence of the religious and connections among book dealers. These intermediaries remain too little known. This is a phenomenon recently very well investigated by Katharina Kaska and Christoph Egger of the National Library in Vienna, who looked at book sales of Austrian monasteries in the interwar period between the 2 world wars. The telling title of Casca and Egger's book, "The Codices Lie Financially Unproductive in the Archive of the Monastery," connects not only to the fact that religious libraries were full of unused heritage books, but that, seen in the spirit of the Enlightenment, they were regarded as useless books. One such case is the Durandus, printed in Vicenza, now in Cambridge University Library, from the Benedictine monastery of Gottweid. The continual renewal of stock of the monastic libraries and its implication for heritage collections in their care is the topic of Antonella Barzazzi in our volume on the impact of secularizations on libraries. The reality is that, especially from the 18th century onwards, other priorities make heritage disposable. For example, the need to purchase new books in monasteries which were intellectually very active, a utilitarian approach brought in by the mendicant and the reformed orders during the later Middle Ages. Books were needed for teaching, preaching, debating, and for missionary purposes. This is an approach which is remote from the ideals of book preservation and heritage, typical of both monastic and humanist culture. What did they dispose of? Books which were attractive for book collectors, such as the classics, without a doubt. Then Baroque, read Counter-Reformation, hagiographical and spiritual collections, practical medicine, popular printing, liturgy, astrology. As we should know well by now, criteria of rarity and utility are very much dependent on the times. But if we manage to follow the threads of survival of books, we will also understand why they survived, not only how. It is this cultural complexity and mobility that an international digital resource such as material evidence in Incunabula manages to capture in collaboration with libraries, custodians of heritage, and scholars from the university and library world specialized in its study, supported by an advanced digital system created and maintained by CERN, which offers not only shared cataloging, but also the possibility of integrated research, which can address historical questions. In this first lecture, I have looked at the mobility of books, the early mobility of their distribution, and the later mobility of their survival. I underlined how the secularizations of religious institutions, a political phenomenon, is behind the largest displacement of books and libraries in European history. How our heritage has turned into a jigsaw puzzle, and how we can trace the agents and trends of the dispersals by working on the books. The examination of the evidence which exists should not be piecemeal, but must be carried out in a comprehensive, coherent, and systematic way. But let me spell it out clearly again. This vital recovery of our scattered heritage can only be done collectively. Thank you.